Hi, Dr. Ariane from the Movement Paradigm. Today, we're going to talk about 5 ways that you can improve your balance because balance is a fundamental component in all movement. Whether you are training for strength or speed or endurance, balance is a key component in all of it. As we break down balance a little bit further, we want to think about 3 essential aspects to balance. So we have our visual system, our vestibular system, and our somatosensory system. So all of these are essential in being able to train this as a system. And as I mentioned, this is fundamental in everything we do, whether we are trying to improve in life and sport or we are trying to prevent falls and focus on longevity and movement. Let's talk about 5 ways that you can improve your balance. Number 1 is creating a safe environment. So in order for us to have optimal stability, we have to feel safe in our nervous system. And the best example that I can give of this is that if I asked you to stand on one leg and you were moving really fast and shaking all over and weren't able to sustain that position, my assessment would be that your nervous system doesn't feel safe in that particular position. That doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just means that that is not the best way to train your balance. And so what we want to think about is creating a safe environment. So for example, taking that same exercise, and what we would do is actually kickstand the leg down in the back. So primarily we're focusing on balancing on that front leg, but we're just kickstanding enough so that we feel safe, so that we can optimize our stability and our balance in that particular position. And the follow-up to that is that we want to be able to breathe diaphragmatically in the position. If it feels like we get into an unsafe place, then we are not going to be able to breathe diaphragmatically because we're in a fight or flight. We're in a survival mechanism. And so with that, we want to be able to be in a position that feels comfortable, we feel connected, and we're able to breathe diaphragmatically. So expanding the abdomen on the inhale, exhaling, contracting, and being able to perform that throughout the whole movement. Number 2, which you hear me talk about all the time, is short foot. And this is essentially about not just a foot exercise, but a foot to core sequencing exercise. It's how we can connect our foot to our pelvis and the rest of our body in a very integrated manner. And so essentially short foot is going to be rooting the tips of the toes into the ground, which will lift the arch of the foot and gently lift the ball of the foot. And of course, as I mentioned, it's not just a foot exercise, but ultimately what we're doing here is connecting that to the rest of our body. So we're using our breath. So taking a breath in, exhaling, gently rooting the tips of the toes into the ground. That's going to activate some of the deep stabilizers on our foot. It activates the deep front fascial line, which connects our foot to our pelvic floor, diaphragm, even all the way up to the tongue and the neck. So this is a great way, one of the best ways to help improve balance over time. And we start with just basic progressions of this kickstand position. And then ultimately, as we'll talk about, is moving into more dynamic positions. So reaching, lunging, things that we're going to do in life. Number 3 is multisensory integration. So as you can see here, I'm standing on a Nervoso mat, which is a textured mat that helps to stimulate specific mechanoreceptors in the bottom of the feet. The more sensory information that we have coming in from our environment is going to drive better movement quality, balance, and stability. So I'm also holding a Nervoso ball where it's a textured surface. And so what we can think about is stacking some of the sensory information. So for example, we can start with having our foot on a Nervoso mat on a textured surface. It could be also, for example, a wood floor, which is a great surface to train on, versus a yoga mat, which decreases our balance, versus carpet, which decreases our balance. So we want to think about hard surfaces, specifically, like I said, wood or something like this, a textured surface that's really optimizing that sensory integration. And then from there, we can add things. So for example, we can add in our visual cues. So we can have a focal point where we're looking at something very specific. So if I move on to one leg, I'm on this sensory surface. Now I'm really focusing in on my eyes. We can even add in our hands to add another layer of sensory integration. So we can hold on to something. We can just grab a ball. It doesn't matter. You don't have to overthink it, but just another aspect of some sensory information that's feeding our motor system. So ultimately, we are using using the sensory information to move efficiently. That's how the human body works. So this is a great way to improve balance. And again, just use it as a stacking. So it depends on what movement might be challenging for you, but you can think about all these things and adding them in slowly at a pace that feels comfortable to improve your balance training. Number 4 is progression. So this is where I often see a lot of balance progressions that most often are not appropriate for the person at that time. So as I mentioned, it's really important to think about a hard surface and hopefully a sensory surface. So essentially some more information that's coming into your nervous system. But one of the biggest things that I find often is that most people will be training on unstable surfaces where they don't feel safe, and they're actually influencing more of their large nerves versus their small nerves. And so what we want to think about is progression. So let's say, for example, in my opinion, all balance is dynamic, but if we were just thinking about, big picture, static position to dynamic position, right? So we could say static position versus dynamic position. So ultimately, we're going to do static before dynamic. We're going to go slow versus fast. So we want to think just basic principles of progression and progressive overload, but we're doing that as it relates to balance. And so when you first start your balance training, just think it should be really simple and you're trying to create this safe environment. And then you can ultimately progress to more higher level things. But initially, we want to think about the basics. And number 5 is fascial integration of your movements. So we already talked about short foot. We already talked about surfaces. We already talked about progressions of how you can progress your balance training. And so now the most important thing is this integrated movement pattern. So just short foot in and of itself is working on fascial tensioning throughout the body. So we're working on tensioning, we're working on elasticity. That's what we need in our movement pattern. So if we are performing these types of exercises where we're moving into different balance challenges, we're reaching, all of these things are going to be a beautiful representation of fascial integration where it's in control, we're in a safe environment, we're diaphragmatically breathing. And I always like to think of if we follow all of these steps and we put them all together, people can improve their balance dramatically. But it's when we go to these really challenging things like Bosu balls and RX pads and unstable surfaces and try to improve our balance, a lot of times that's not the most efficient way to train it. Now, today I've talked about just some basic principles of balance. Please know that there are lots of other layers to this. There's lots of other exercises, but I just want to give you a really good understanding of how we can slowly progress our balance in a very safe and effective way. And just remember that as it relates to our feet, especially by the age of 40, we have a peak sensitivity in our feet. By the age of 70, we need twice as much stimulation in our feet to have the same response. So that's why falls are increased so much as we get older. So what I really want you to think of is that the more time that we can spend barefoot, that means no socks, no shoes, and really begin to stimulate the skin on the bottom of the feet, we can have a huge influence in a positive way on your balance. So if this was helpful, give it a like, give it a share. Of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Movement Paradigm, for weekly tips on mindset, nutrition, and movement. And if you need help with your movement and barefoot training and overall health, please reach out. We would love to help you.